In the interest of some time, we will continue with the program. We're so honored to have today the Honorable Brent McIntosh, exceptional leader, great future ahead of him. He is an adjunct senior fellow for international economics and finance at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2019 to 2021, he served as Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, where he oversaw Treasury's international economic and financial policy work, including its leadership in the CFIUS process. Having been one very engaged in that CFIUS process of the FIRMA bill, I can tell you he gave exceptional leadership to it. During 2020, he coordinated several initiatives to alleviate the COVID-19 pandemic's economic consequences. Mr. McIntosh served from 2017 to 2019 as Treasury's General Counsel, leading the department's approximately 2,000 lawyers and spearheading its regulatory reform efforts. Before joining Treasury, Mr. McIntosh was a partner in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell and co-headed the firm's cybersecurity practice. Mr. McIntosh served as a lawyer in the White House from 2006 until 2009. Before that, he was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the United States Justice Department. He studied at the University of Michigan, the London School of Economics, and Yale Law School. Mr. Brent McIntosh, thank you, sir, for your service to our country and for being with us today. And I'm sure folks will continue to come in.
Thanks. A sincere thank you to you, Congressman, for organizing this terrific event and for including me in it. I appreciate, and I think we should all appreciate, the work you do to bring together a lot of parliamentarians from like-minded countries to work on national security issues of common concern and work toward common solutions to those issues. I also appreciate the thoughtful insights from the speakers yesterday and today. Really insightful, thoughtful conversation here. And I want to thank as well our Panamanian hosts for their great hospitality in the face of real challenges having us here. We have exciting weather outside. I'm hopeful that the weather will cooperate and I'll get thunderclaps and lightning on the key points in my remarks, but if not, and if that tree should come through this window, I hope someone will warn me of it. I'm going to talk today about adversarial foreign investment, which is investment in our countries that is not merely commercial, but that will have national security effects for our countries, posing challenges to the national security of our countries. There are innumerable forms that adversarial foreign investment can take. It can be the acquisition of technologies with military or intelligence uses. It can be the acquisition of critical infrastructure such as power grids or parts of power grids, medical systems, that if misused could hobble our countries. It can be the acquisition of data centers that house sensitive personal data about our citizens or even members of our military. It could be the acquisition of sensitive personal data itself. It could be the acquisition of private educational institutions, thus granting control over the curriculum of those institutions. It could be the acquisition of real estate near our military installations from which to conduct surveillance of the activities conducted there. The scope and variety of potential adversarial foreign investment is really limited only by the economic activities our countries undertake, as well as acquiring companies and acquiring countries' imaginations. In the United States, the primary mechanism through which we police adversarial foreign investment into the United States is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which we call CFIUS. CFIUS is an interagency committee of the executive branch in the United States. It's chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury, who for the past 4 years was my boss, and it reports ultimately to the President of the United States. CFIUS runs a process of screening inbound corporate transactions, deals, to isolate and identify ill-intentioned foreign investment or investment that would harm our national security. The CFIUS process ultimately can result in the blocking of those transactions, can direct that transactions not occur. The United States has been using the CFIUS process to screen for adversarial foreign investment for 4 decades. So at this point, we have extensive experience both with the successes of that process as well as its shortcomings. Prior to leaving government service, as the Congressman mentioned, I spent a great deal of time working on CFIUS, first as the General Counsel to the chair of the committee, the Treasury Secretary, then later as the Undersecretary who had responsibility for the committee's work. So in light of that background, I thought it worthwhile to share some thoughts on the state of adversarial foreign investment and on the strengths and weaknesses of our investment process in hopes that we can share lessons learned that can benefit all of our countries, both best practices that can be adopted as well as shortcomings to be avoided. So let me start by saying that during the prior administration, our CFIUS process was improved dramatically. It emerged as a more robust, muscular, and rigorous screening process. That was due in no small part to the foresight and proactive leadership of our host today, Congressman Pittenger, who played a critical role in passing reform legislation that I'll discuss later. I'm going to start by laying out the nature of the threat and then some contours of the process we use for weeding out adversarial foreign investment. And then I'll turn to the reforms we recently adopted for that process and then describe some of what I see as the challenges for the future of that process. The nature of the threat. Foreign direct investment plays a massive role in the global economy. In the United States, for example, to use a pre-pandemic baseline, in 2018, we had $4.3 trillion, trillion with a T, in foreign direct investment. And the pace of foreign investment is only increasing. The United Nations estimates that foreign investment around the world would increase 10 or 15% this year and 20 to 30% next year. So policing foreign investment poses a number of difficult challenges for all of our countries. In the United States, on principle and by tradition, we maintain an open investment climate for foreign direct investment. That openness and the foreign capital it attracts, combined with the dynamism of the American economy, to make the United States an exceptionally attractive destination for capital flows. It's the largest economy in the world and deeply interconnected with other countries, which makes it difficult for any one government agency to stay on top of all transactions coming into the United States. The United States is also home to a great number of innovative companies, including cutting-edge technology companies that develop products whose ultimate uses may be unclear or indeterminate at the time of a particular transaction, making it difficult to determine what is and what is not sensitive technology. Finally, the United States is founded on constitutional principles that activities, whether economic or otherwise, are presumptively allowed, presumptively permitted, unless they are affirmatively barred by the legislature. And the legislature goes through the appropriate proceedings to bar them. Even then, there are constitutional freedoms that the government can't abridge. All this makes the threat environment for adversarial foreign investment a very challenging one, and the reality we see with regard to foreign investment reflects those circumstances. Over the past decades, and especially the past decade, we have seen increased interest in acquiring American companies, technologies, data, in situations where the transfer of those companies or data or technologies would pose a threat to the United States national security. And that activity has spanned many different sectors. There are obvious ones, technologies that have military uses and cutting-edge computing technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, telecommunications equipment, providers of critical infrastructure. But it's critical to recognize that there are also any number of other sectors where the threat may be less obvious, but it's just as real. For example, social media companies that collect data on Americans, including members of our military, companies that run private schools, producers of goods that, while low-tech, are nonetheless single-source inputs into critical military technologies. I would say that for those of you who are interested in thinking about the range of threats that adversarial foreign investment can pose, the CFIUS team at the Treasury produces every year an annual report which categorizes a number of the different sectors from which these threats can emerge, and I would commend it to you. It's available, it's sent to Congress and available publicly on the Treasury website. It's eye-opening the range of potential threats. Just as there are many different sectors from which adversarial foreign investment can emerge, It's also true that threats can originate from many different countries, not just obvious adversaries. To be sure, and this will be no surprise, a substantial fraction of the CFIUS transactions we review and that have been drawn public attention in recent years have originated from China. That's consistent with overall investment trends in recent years. The most prevalent country from which CFIUS transactions emanate, problematic or not, has been China. For example, in the period 2017 to 2019, nearly 700 transactions were reviewed by CFIUS. 140 of those were Chinese originated, which is about 20%. No other country accounted for more than 100. But it's important to note that according to our CFIUS review, not every Chinese transaction is problematic, and not every problematic transaction is Chinese. On the contrary, we see threats emerging from many different countries. The diversity of different threat vectors teaches us that all transactions must be evaluated individually, carefully, on a deal-by-deal basis. Exacerbating the difficulty of doing that review, we have to recognize that it's often difficult to determine the nationality of the acquirer. It's often difficult to determine the ultimate ownership behind a foreign acquirer. Who's really behind an entity that's incorporated in Jersey or the Cayman Islands? Does a complex corporate structure, for example, hide ownership interests that don't show up in the org chart or control that doesn't show up in the org chart? Is an acquirer a private company or a state-owned enterprise? And in many countries, notably China again, the line between a private company and a state-owned enterprise has a tendency to blur. It's often difficult to determine which is which, and at times, even what are called private companies are subject to comprehensive government control. Sometimes that's by law, as with the national security laws in China that require cooperation with the government and the provision of data to the government, no questions asked. At other times, it's merely a matter of custom or pressure or unequal political influence, as, for example, Ant Financial recently found out, and that was all over the news. In response to this reality, the United States CFIUS process is intended to vindicate a pair of objectives that are mutually interdependent. First, protection of the national security of the United States. Second, maintenance of the outstanding open investment environment that we prize so much. I say that these objectives are mutually interdependent because in practice they're necessary to one another, not in tension as some might think. Only with vigilant screening of foreign direct investment can we afford the open investment climate, the open investment environment that is an engine of growth for our country. On the other hand, American economic strength underpins American national security. So we pursue these twin goals through an investment review process that's chaired by the Treasury Department and incorporates input from more than a dozen federal agencies. That allows us to bring to bear expertise that ranges from financial to industry-specific to the highly classified intelligence inputs that are provided in our reviews. These reviews are all transaction-specific. They're all about a single transaction that's been notified to us as potentially problematic. They are not blanket prohibitions on particular sectors or particular countries. We review them one by one. These reviews are based only on national security, not economic or other policy interests. The review process involves all these agencies getting together with parts of the intelligence community to evaluate the possibility that there is a threat in a particular transaction. Even where that review identifies a potential threat, CFIUS will move to block a transaction only if the attendant threat cannot be mitigated through a binding agreement that the government strikes and signs with the parties to the transaction. So for example, in 2019, there were 231 transactions investigated by CFIUS. Only one was blocked, but 28, or more than 10%, were allowed to proceed after the committee reached an agreement with the parties to mitigate outstanding national security concerns. The mitigation we reach with parties can take a number of different forms. For example, it can be ensuring that only authorized persons at the companies have access to certain sensitive technologies. It can be the establishment of a binding agreement governing contracts to provide goods or services to the United States government, what we call a supply assurance agreement, to ensure that we do not have an interrupted supply of those goods from a particular company. It could be prohibiting the transfer of certain technologies or intellectual property, or it can, in cases, be the carving out of certain assets of the targeted company for divestiture so that they are not transferred to the acquiring company. These measures are crafted on a transaction-specific basis to mitigate the particular harms that a transaction poses. They are tailored to the harm posed by that transaction. CFIUS has a monitoring capacity that allows the team to ensure that all of the mitigation measures we put in place are scrupulously adhered to. With all that said, the vast majority of the transactions we review are not problematic, and they are approved quickly by the committee. Those that present continuing threats that the parties cannot or will not mitigate through agreement with the government are referred to the President of the United States, who may block their consummation. Each transaction is different, and each implicates the interests and expertise of different agencies within our executive branch, all of whom are around the table for these discussions. On deals involving technologies with military uses, for example, the Department of Defense may be a critical player in discussions. On deals involving critical infrastructure, the Department of Homeland Security may play a central role. On deals involving pharmaceutical or chemical manufacturing or medical device production, the key agencies might be the Department of Commerce or of Agriculture or even the Department of Health and Human Services, which is not normally a member of the committee, but we can bring into the committee's considerations where the expertise of a particular agency is necessary. All of these agencies have CFIUS units embedded in them, some of them larger than others. Treasury's is by far the largest because of the chairmanship of the committee. But they each have an expertise within them, resident within them, to review particular transactions that are of interest to them. Thus, the CFIUS process is flexible enough to bring a wide variety of investment targets within its remit, in each case bring relevant experience to bear on those transactions. Now, we all know that committees by their nature are unwieldy and can be quite slow, much slower often than a single actor. But using a committee in the United States is how we ensure that the relevant experts are at the table for each of these transaction reviews. We recognize that that has the potential to make the review process long. And so in an effort to discipline ourselves, we have a series of deadlines to ensure we accomplish timely action in reviewing these transactions. Each transaction review starts with a notice from the parties that they are about to conduct a transaction. The CFIUS team then has 45 days to investigate, to review whether the transaction needs further investigation. If it does, then there's a 45-day investigation period during which there's intensive interaction with the parties to get the information necessary to determine whether there is a national security threat. And after that pair of 45-day periods, if the CFIUS committee determines that there is a threat that justifies taking a transaction to the president and mitigation cannot be achieved, the president then has 15 days in which to act to block the transaction or not do so. We think these deadlines strike a reasonable balance between moving quickly in a way that's commercially viable and nonetheless doing a thorough and thoughtful review of the national security aspects of a particular transaction poses. We always strive to act within these deadlines. There are times when a particularly complex transaction will require extensions, but it is always our goal to act within the deadlines. One of the lessons of modern policymaking is, of course, that no tool is perfect forever. And we must always be aware of the way in which the problems we are attempting to solve adapt to the measures that we have put in place to solve them or evade those measures. Investment screening in this regard is no different. Decades of experience with CFIUS have given American policymakers a clear view of which investments have adapted to evade CFIUS effects and the areas in which CFIUS could or should be amended or improved. As a result, the most expansive reforms in CFIUS's 4-decade history were enacted in August of 2008 in the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which we affectionately call FIRMA. And Congressman Pittenger was a key architect of this work. These reforms were fully in place as of February of last year, 2020, when the extensive regulatory revisions we had to put in place to make the law effective were finally in place. With FIRMA, Congress expanded our investment security screening authorities to better address national security concerns arising from transaction forms that were previously outside our jurisdiction. In particular, CFIUS had previously reviewed only transactions that conferred control of the target company. We found that some investors were structuring transactions that didn't confer control, but did confer the sort of rights that posed exactly the same national security concerns as a control transaction would have, but managed to skirt CFIUS's jurisdictional boundaries. For example, a transaction might be structured so the investment didn't confer control of the target company, but did give the investing company access to or control over critical technologies that the target company manufactures. With FIRMA, we closed that loophole in very sensitive areas. We can now review certain non-controlling transactions that would provide a foreign acquirer rights, access, or involvement in a U.S. business involved in critical technologies, critical infrastructure, or sensitive personal data of American citizens. Additionally, Congress closed a loophole in CFIUS jurisdiction by permitting review of certain transactions involving real estate that was proximate to military institutions. So we're no longer allowing our adversaries to buy purchase from which to spy on our military. At the same time CFIUS's jurisdiction was expanded, it gained greater resources and staff to proactively identify transactions that might be subject to CFIUS, but where the parties did not notify us of the existence of the transaction, which was always a concern of ours, that we wouldn't be notified of a transaction, we'd learn of it only after the damage had already been done. And we developed a process for short form filings to expedite the process for certain forms of transactions. So expanded jurisdiction, expanded surveillance authorities, and more robust processes, all of which required substantial expansion of the staff and resources we dedicate to CFIUS, and we implemented that expansion over a 2-year period after the passage of the reform legislation during a time of intense programmatic activity for the CFIUS team. We couldn't stop and do the reforms while not approving transactions. So at the same time we had an increased pace of transaction, we were implementing the reforms. My friend and former colleague, Tommy Feddo, recently provided some data on CFIUS's functioning in a Wall Street Journal column. Between the passage of FIRMA and the end of the Trump administration, CFIUS reviewed transactions valued at more than $400 billion. In 2019, we reviewed 5 times as many transactions as CFIUS had reviewed in 2009, so a massive increase in just 10 years. More transactions were blocked in the past 4 years than had been blocked in the entire history of the committee. Still not a large number, but a meaningful change in the posture of the committee. So we're proud of the health and the strength and the vigor of our investment security screening regime. It's as effective and well-resourced as it's ever been, but that said, we'd be foolish to think that our work is done. I want to identify at least 2 significant challenges that we confront. First is international coordination. In an interconnected world where data and technologies are often shared among like-minded countries, we can't afford weak links in our screening process in any country. That's why after the reform legislation was passed, our Treasury team consulted with scores of foreign partners to assist them in establishing and maintaining their own rigorous investment screening regimes, and we're seeing real improvements in a number of countries. Our Treasury team could be counted on to provide unvarnished advice to our foreign partners from our 4 decades of experience on both best practices to be adopted and stumbles to be avoided. As the digitization of the economy accelerates, as information becomes even more central to our economic success, and as cross-border data flows multiply, it'll be all the more important for like-minded countries with market economies and open investment environments to coordinate closely on investment screening. We'll be sharing lessons learned and best practices, but we also need to work on a more tactical level to identify trends and patterns and novel threats in cross-border investment activity. International coordination on investment security is as active and dynamic as it's ever been, but we must nonetheless redouble our efforts to ensure bad actors can't exploit any lack of coordination. So for those of you who are interested in this topic, I would urge you to contact the team currently at the U.S. Treasury if you have questions or thoughts or want to talk through some of these issues. Second, and greater challenge we face in this space is the evolving threat environment. In that regard, there are 2 different forces at work. One is a change in our adversaries' tactics. The other is a change in their goals. Regarding tactics, start with the premise that our investment security screening regime is very effective at what it does, which is to say it's very effective at deal-by-deal transaction analysis for transactions that fall within its jurisdiction. It's good at finding irremediable threats from particular transactions. But that means that CFIUS jurisdiction is defined by the transactions it reviews, not necessarily by the threats it's designed to thwart. So the more effective our screening mechanism is, the more effective it is at finding and rooting out those problematic transactions, the more incentive our adversaries have to achieve their goals through means that fall outside CFIUS's jurisdiction. For example, I'm confident that CFIUS would look poorly on a transaction in which a Chinese acquirer acquired an American company that held massive quantities of sensitive personal data about Americans. But what about a Chinese company that built an app that was downloaded off the App Store in your phone, in your country, and collected that data without acquisition of an American company? That sounds familiar to all of us, and that's not necessarily a transaction that falls within CFIUS's jurisdiction. Similarly, the Chinese company could buy access to that data without ever conducting a corporate control or non-control transaction. Similarly, one could assume that CFIUS would disfavor a transaction in which an acquirer from a hostile power acquired a particularly sensitive technology through acquisition of an American company. But if they merely licensed that technology or found other ways to get access to it, that may not be a transaction within our investment security mechanism's jurisdiction. You could spin out limitless hypotheticals of this sort. Each one presents a threat. And in each instance, our adversaries have every incentive to structure those transactions in ways that evade our screening mechanism's jurisdiction. That's their tactics. Now let's talk about their goals. Keep in mind that the digital transformation I referenced earlier and the ease of collecting and exporting data as described in the hypothetical I just referenced is changing the nature of our economies quite thoroughly. Many of the national security threats of today don't require ownership of US companies or US developed technologies, companies or technologies developed in your countries. They don't require physical presence in the United States or like-minded countries. They don't require traditional debt or equity investments in American or American companies or companies from your countries. They don't require transactions that are structured in ways that trip the jurisdictional tripwire we use for investment screening. These rising threats don't require ownership of sensitive data or technologies. They merely require access to sensitive data and technologies. And compounding this complexity, there is no international agreed framework for data governance. My friend Dan Price, who's known to many of you, has argued that we need an international body to coordinate international standards for data governance, much as the Financial Stability Board does coordination for financial stability measures. But for the foreseeable future, there will be no international agreement on that topic. So that state of affairs leaves the possession of much sensitive data to the whims of commercial actors, as long as they structure their acquisition of that data in a way that doesn't trip our jurisdictional tripwire for investment screening and avoids certain export control regimes. To address these sorts of adversarial tactics and this sort of evolving digitized vulnerability, it's vital to recognize that our investment screening process is just one part of an integrated suite of tools of economic statecraft, all of which serve to protect our national security and secure our foreign policy objectives. This suite includes CFIUS and other investment screening mechanisms that countries deploy, but it also includes sanctions and AML and CFT, as we've been discussing at this conference, export controls, blacklisting, entity listings, etc. And while our investment screening mechanism is as strong and effective now as it's ever been, neither investment screening nor any other tool of economic statecraft is infinitely flexible. Where the threat of adversarial foreign investment comes in a form that doesn't fit easily into our investment screening mechanism, it's prudent to look for other means by which to combat that harm, such as the use of export controls and entity listings. Even considering the full suite of tools of economic statecraft at our disposal, there are inevitably threats that fall beyond the jurisdiction or capability of those tools, as we've traditionally understood them. So strong as they are, our current set of tools does not address the full panoply of threats that might be grouped under the rubric adversarial foreign investment. That means that at times we must stretch our authorities to reach novel threats, so long as we do so within the bounds of the law. At other times we must seek modifications of our current authorities to reach new threats, as the prior U.S. administration did in seeking reforms to CFIUS's jurisdiction and procedures to make them more fit for purpose. And even then, at times, we'll inevitably find threats that are not well addressed by our current suite of tools, and that call for creative thinking about new tools to develop, enact into law, and deploy, bring to bear to secure ourselves against adversarial foreign investments and other threats. To make these sorts of analyses, we need clear thinking, we need gap analysis to determine, to map our authorities against the threats they're designed to thwart, and figure out where our current tools are less effective than we would like them to be, and work to remedy those gaps. In making that determination, the real challenge is striking the right balance to preserve both an open investment environment and our nation's national security, our respective nations' national security. We need a rigorous approach to that gap analysis to determine what tools to deploy. At the same time, we need to respect and maintain the open investment environments that power economic growth in each of our countries. Striking that balance will require prudence, vigilance, and creative thinking, and it will also require the international collaboration that events such as this one represent. Thanks very much. Muchas gracias.